Great. Thank you very much. My stock always goes up when I speak in Canada, since my wife's Canadian. And you never think of Canadians as being chauvinists until they cross the border into the United States. So every July 1st, she hangs a giant Canadian flag in front of our house and then leaves it up through July 4th. So there's no question in our neighborhood as to where our loyalties lie. She's been doing this every year, and this year I watched the brother of our neighbor come in down the other driveway and turn and look at the flag and go, "Fucking Canadians." My daughter's also a freshman at UBC, so I want to talk a little bit about the state of journalism, which I think is an important topic because it's a reflection of this huge societal shift that's taken place as we are moving from a print-based culture to an image-based culture. And that is the sort of focus of my book, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. I find that shift terrifying for many reasons, not least of which is that those images are largely controlled by corporate forces. Images are emotionally driven. That is how they are most effective. They do not deal with nuance, ambiguity, and that faculty for critical thinking, that capacity to dissect a society and understand where we're going, is gradually being eroded. One of the things we find in the United States, and Canada is always a reflection of the United States about 10 years later. We do everything wrong, and then 10 years later you copy us, which is how you get Harper. It's your version of George W. Bush. But the assault against the media in Canada is certainly parallels the kind of assault that we have seen in the United States, and some of you may have seen it. I ran into one of your troglodytes, Kevin O'Leary, over the Occupy issue. The difference being that O'Leary, because he's Canadian, didn't interrupt me. So I actually got to score some points. If you were on Fox TV, they never let you finish. They will constantly interrupt and then mischaracterize what it is you're saying. I once had a debate Christopher Hitchens, not an experience I would wish on anyone in this room, and he used precisely that technique. It was over the issue of atheism, and for me, my attack on the New Atheists, I had debated Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith at UCLA as well, was just a kind of secular fundamentalism and a demonization. I spent 7 years in the Middle East as the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, a demonization of Muslims. They just did it from a secular point of view. So instead of attacking Islam as a satanic religion, they attacked Islam for being barbarous, for barbarity, for not embracing the values, so-called values of Western civilization. They also externalized evil. The political configurations of the Christian right that Harris and Hitchens purportedly despised came together in their own viewpoint in sort of justifying, although in the language of scientific rationalism, the right to use force to impose our quote-unquote virtues on the rest of the country. But that debate was very similar in that Hitchens would interrupt and start screaming. This is something now you see on TV, and it's of course creeping into Canada as well. And he, at one point, I debated him at Berkeley, he started yelling, "Shame on you for defending suicide bombers." That's the kind of technique that you get into. It's carnival barking, and you can't win. It's why I won't go on Fox News. I don't go on CNN either, because it's all, at the most you're ever going to get is 4 to 6 minutes. And so you have to speak or use the language of easily identifiable cliches in order for the audience to resonate. And if what you're thinking doesn't fit within those cliches, then you become unintelligible. And that, of course, has now just been carried out through the wider culture. So we've seen a kind of transference of information, and certainly many people in this room increasingly get their information off of screens. And I think that what has happened is that cultural shift, along with a very important commercial shift, has led to the collapse of newsprint. Now, it used to be that newspapers had a monopoly connecting sellers with buyers. That monopoly is now broken through the internet. It's far easier for sellers to target buyers through particular websites, and they don't need newsprint anymore. And yet, newsprint still clings to the old paradigm of objectivity or neutrality or impartiality, the sort of foundational ethos of the New York Times. And that paradigm was put in place at the end of the 19th century by newspaper owners, not because it was the most effective way to transmit the truth, but because it neutralized any kind of opposition and made sure that it gave a voice, often an equal voice, when it didn't deserve it, to forces in power to attract advertising. And so we went through this remarkable period from, let's say, the end of the 19th century up through about a decade, 2 decades ago, when newsprint began its collapse, when newspapers like the New York Times were absolutely flush with unbelievable amounts of money. The Times was making 23, 24% profit. I covered the Balkan War for the New York Times, and my 1-year bureau budget, and it excluded the salaries of 4 photographers and 2 reporters, was $600,000. Those ages are gone. That kind of money is gone. Everything is shrinking. Everything is declining. Newspapers are becoming more anemic, and as they become more anemic, they become even more frightened. Now, the problem with the commercial press is that the commercial press, as my friend Sidney Schamberg says, it didn't necessarily make things better, but it helped stop things from getting worse. The unwritten credo of the New York Times when I was there was, do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and money. You can alienate them sometimes, but like any good reporter, when you're hammering against a particular center of power, then you become a headache within the newsroom. And the closer physically that newsroom is to those centers of power, the less that you can say. So I spent my career at the New York Times overseas. I was there for 15 years. I started in the Middle East, then went on to the Balkans, then I was based in Paris covering Al-Qaeda. And the kinds of things that I could say publicly about, for instance, Slobodan Milosevic, the kind of critique that I could make about the Serbian government or the Saudi government became totally unpalatable once I came back to the United States and made that same kind of critique against my own government. And that is what finally led to my departure from the Times in the build-up to the war in Iraq. I had written my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and was on various programs, Charlie Rose, I don't know if you get Charlie Rose in Canada, these kind of national talk shows. And because I had spent so long in the Middle East, I would invariably be asked about the impending invasion of Iraq, the call to invade Iraq. Now, as somebody who speaks Arabic, although it's deteriorated since I left the Middle East, but I spoke it pretty well when I was there, as somebody who spent months of my life in Iraq, it was obvious, and I think it was obvious to most Arabists, that all of the calls by the Bush administration to invade Iraq were fatuous. I had covered the first Gulf War. I'd been with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, gone into Kuwait, then actually after the fall of Kuwait, drove through Safran and was in Basra during the Shiite rebellion. until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard. And was there for the Shiite uprising. Indeed, the second day that I was with a light armor battalion when I was a prisoner, and we were trying to punch our way north to Baghdad, and about 60 miles north of Baghdad, we were ambushed by Shiite rebels in a small town. And I remember when the bullets started to go and the convoy was being hit, my captors were yelling back and forth as a kind of query, askari, askari, which is the word in Arabic for army, because there were army units that had rebelled, and they were terrified that they were being attacked not by 16-year-old Shiite kids with AK-47s, but by a trained unit, which meant that we would have been in incredible trouble. As it turned out, they were kids who had opened crates of guns, a lot of them bringing over by Iran. Well, 30,000 Shiites were killed. Now, the Shiites had been called, or the call to rise up had been given by first President George Bush, and they had responded. And then not only were they abandoned, but while I was there, Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was given permission to put their helicopters back up in the air, which meant, in essence, that the rebellion would be crushed, because what the United States did not want was a Shiite-dominated Iraq, although eventually that's what they get with Maliki. And so 30,000 Shiites are killed. Then I stay on after the war, and I cover the UN inspection teams, where all of the stockpiles, and he had them, of chemical and biological agents, mostly in artillery shells, are destroyed. And so it was quite clear, especially after the sanctions, that Saddam was not only not a threat to us, but not a threat to his neighbors. The idea that a country inculcated with Baathism and Arab nationalism would greet us as liberators was, of course, folly. The argument that the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction, these were all lies. And yet to say that at that particular moment, although it was grounded in a kind of truth, was politically forbidden. And so I gave a commencement address at Rockford College in Rockford, Illinois, which is on YouTube, where I was denouncing the war in 2003, and people started to stand and heckle and boo, and they cut my microphone twice. And at one point, 1,000 members of the crowd got up and began singing "God Bless America." And then the campus security come and escorted me off the stage before the awarding of diplomas because they were worried about incensed members of the graduating class attacking me on the podium. Remember, when I got off the stage, I said, but my jacket, it's in the president's office. They said, we'll mail you your jacket. And they drove me to the bus station and put me on a bus for Chicago. And then what happened was the cable shows got a hold of the clip, and they lynch you in the same way that they lynched Jeremiah Wright, where they pull a particular soundbite and then they loop it hour after hour after hour for 4 days. And this pressured the Times to respond, which they did by giving me a formal written reprimand saying I was no longer allowed to speak out against the war, at which point I left the newspaper, since I wasn't, I knew, which turned out to be correct, that I would lose friends in Iraq, and the debacle that was completely foreseeable would be carried out. The question is why? Why did the New York Times and virtually all of the major media in the United States decide to abrogate their role as journalists and essentially act as cheerleaders? And I think it comes down to a couple issues. First of all, it goes back to that insecurity that is born of declining revenues and shrinking circulation. It goes back on to this thirst by powerful news organizations for access. I was shipped off to Paris and was covering al-Qaeda out of Paris in Europe and North Africa, so I was spending a lot of time with French intelligence, and the French were just pulling their hair out because they realized that this whole drive to invade Iraq was insane. And I would come back to New York and sit in the room, if you follow it closely, with figures like Judy Miller, and it was like they'd all drunk from the Kool-Aid. They couldn't hear anything that the French intelligence said. And the French intelligence were far ahead of the Americans in terms of al-Qaeda. They had human assets inside of al-Qaeda, which the Americans didn't have. The Americans are a little over-reliant on electronic surveillance. But you couldn't hear it. And that's the problem with that kind of nationalism, which infects the media organizations as well. Nationalism is a disease. The flip side of nationalism is always racism. So that when I would come back from Paris for these meetings and then go back to Tunis or wherever I was headed, even within the newsroom of the New York Times, I would hear jokes about the French, because anybody, of course, who wasn't with us was against us. And these jokes were racist. And it was the kind of miasma that infected the country, of which the press was not immune. Now, all of the sort of great reporting that within the United States is held up, Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, the story that's not told is that it was always the alternative press, which never made any money, which shamed the traditional organizations, the traditional press, into reporting. So I write for a website out of Los Angeles run by Robert Scheer, who was, in the 1960s, the editor of Ramparts. Ramparts never made a dime, but Ramparts actually began reporting the war in Vietnam. In fact, that iconic picture of the little girl running down the road in Vietnam, naked, being burned by napalm, was first published in Ramparts as a photo essay in Ramparts. And the backstory of that is that Martin Luther King was at an airport with Robert Abernathy reading that article and pushed his food away. And Abernathy said, "Is there something wrong with your food?" And King said, "Nothing will taste right until I denounce this war," which led King to get up on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church to deliver this blistering and beautiful attack on not only on the war, but on American imperialism, America being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that attack led to Lyndon Johnson removing the 4 plainclothes FBI agents who had been assigned to protect King. King, of course, had received numerous death threats, and both King and Johnson knew what that meant, meaning a year later that King, of course, was assassinated. It was the power of the alternative press, which in the beginning of the war, the commercial press does what it always does, and that's run to the establishment. And the alternative press provided a narrative that was truthful and factual, that countered the lies of the power elite, and forced the commercial press to respond. But they would have never responded if that alternative press hadn't been there. And we see in the rise of the Occupy movement, which I was very supportive of and very involved in. I think Cornel West spoke here, right? Cornel and I in Zuccotti Park, we did a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs. I remember Cornel and I went in the night before, and we worked with the Occupy organizers. We had brought in people whose homes had been foreclosed, school teachers, New York City public school teachers who had lost their jobs, and then Cornel and I went to dinner, and the first thing he said to me was, "Where are all these so-called intellectuals?" Which was a pretty good question. Where were they? Nowhere to be found, virtually, in Zuccotti Park. And if you remember, the trigger of sort of public support that was engendered for the Occupy movement occurred when 4 women were kettled, surrounded by orange plastic netting and pepper spray. Well, that was filmed by the Occupy media unit. And what we saw with the rise of the Occupy movement, in essence, was exactly what we saw in the 1960s with the rise of an alternative media that shamed the traditional press into responding. The difference is that, of course, now the traditional press is not able to bring in the amount of revenues, and it no longer has the kind of monolithic power that it had in the 1960s. That's the first difference. The second difference is that the press has become completely corporatized. We have roughly a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, that control 90% of what most Americans listen to or watch. And they impose this sort of bland uniformity of opinion when they're not pumping into your face celebrity gossip and trivia and sports events. And so the room by which dissident voices can be heard have been shrunk exponentially to what, I remember, it's what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. And once you step outside of that paradigm, you walk into a wilderness. You're not heard. And so the transformation within the media landscape, one with the consolidation of press in the hands of roughly a half dozen corporations, the declining effectiveness of newsprint, coupled with the dearth of alternative media, has created a kind of huge black hole, which it's becoming increasingly difficult to escape from. And with that black hole, of course, comes, which is what they want, a kind of historical amnesia. We forget where we came from, how we got to where we are. I teach inmates at a prison in New Jersey. And I don't know how it is here, but in an American college, your professors will try and write up for the course catalog something that sounds as sort of exciting and novel as possible to attract students. Is exactly the opposite when you teach in a prison, because you're trying to get it passed through the prison administration. So the course before last, I just taught a course on African American history. The course before that was American history, and it was, the write-up was how our country was founded and our values and founding fathers, which was all got approved. And then I went out and bought every inmate or prisoner a copy of Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. And Zinn points out in that book, and I think that's why it's such an important book, that within American society, and I know Canada is configured a little differently, but within American society, they were terrified of direct democracy or popular democracy. Our country was founded not only by people who enthusiastically embraced the genocide of Native Americans, but for the most part were, of course, slave owners as well. And the idea was not just to disenfranchise indigenous communities, African American people, but women, and of course people without property. And then we installed an electoral college. I mean, many people don't know that Al Gore actually got 500,000 more votes in the popular vote than did George W. Bush, but because of the electoral college and courtesy of the Supreme Court, of course, and the stopping the recount in Florida, George Bush was in essence appointed president by fiat. It used to be that senators were appointed. Senators had most of the legislative powers. So Zinn does a very good job of sort of talking about how all of the openings within the democratic system were brought to us by movements, which never achieved formal positions of power. So you had the abolitionists, the suffragists who fought for women's rights, the labor movement, and of course, finally, the civil rights movement. And I think you could argue that until he was killed in 1968, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Martin Luther King, because when he went to Memphis, or when he went to Selma, or he went to Birmingham, 50,000 people went with him. And these movements were able to hold fast to moral imperatives. And I think that at its core, this is the only thing that's going to save us, is by rebuilding a press that holds fast to moral imperatives. The paradigm will be different for your generation. I look at young journalists who are starting out, and they don't have the opportunities to make a living that I had. When I began as a freelance reporter in El Salvador, covering the war in the early 1980s, I could sell to a variety of publications. Major metropolitan dailies all had foreign pages, so I could write for the Baltimore Sun, I wrote for the Christian Science Monitor, I actually wrote for the Globe and Mail, I used to work for a show called Sunday Morning. Do they still have Sunday Morning? Anyway, it was on CBC, which would do these long 20-minute produced pieces. Anybody do radio here? They used to have this bizarre rule where you could never have voice for more than 45 seconds. This was some CBC rule before you had to like put in a sound of something. I don't know. It was, only the CBC threw that at me. And you could survive as a freelancer. That's all gone. It's vanished. It's not there anymore. The Baltimore Sun doesn't have a foreign page. The Boston Globe doesn't have foreign correspondents. The Philadelphia Inquirer, and a lot of these papers are going through bankruptcy, is a shell of what it was. And so none of us made very much money, but we made enough that we could survive. Well, all of that's gone. And I think that that is part of this larger, and that's why I think that what's happened to journalism is a kind of window into what's happening to the culture of large, not least of which, of course, is education, and that is the shift that's been imposed upon us by corporate power. We have, in essence, undergone a corporate coup d'etat, to steal a line from John Ralston Saul, in slow motion. I think Saul's right. And you see it in every sort of institution that, if you want to boil it down to its most basic level, deals with beauty or truth. Anything that has the capacity to transform. Education, for instance, is now supposed to be vocational. I mean, business schools, I believe you have one here, have no place on a university campus. None. Before anyone gets too excited, I once spoke at, I think it was the University of Winnipeg, and I thought I was being very radical. And then when I finished, a faculty stood up and said, I want everyone to know that he's not a Marxist, he's just a radical Keynesian. And it turns out they were all Marxists. So this stuff sort of sets people on fire in America, but so I have to sort of recognize that in Canada you actually still have these debates. So what's happened with these corporate forces, and of course that's part of the assault on education, is that there's a huge difference between teaching people how to think and teaching people what to think. And corporations want to teach you what to think, and the last thing they want to teach you is how to think. And the way that they do that is essentially destroying the capacity for critical thought, robbing you of the very vocabulary. Because education, as Socrates and others have pointed out, is by its nature subversive. It is about asking questions about societal structures and assumptions, critical questions. And they don't want you to be able to ask those questions. So I wrote a book, I see it's over here, called Death of the Liberal Class. That book actually started out as a book on the press. It wasn't my idea, and it was a really good lesson. It's the only book that ever began like that. If there are any writers in the room, don't ever write a book that was somebody else's idea. And they called me up. I mean, the funny part is that, I don't know, some bright editor at Knopf decided they need a book on the press. So they called the former editor of the Washington Post, and he didn't want to do it. And then they called the former editor of the New York Times, and he didn't want to do it. And then somehow they called me, as if a book that I wrote would bear any resemblance to a book on the press by the former editors of the Post or the Times. And I did write it when the Ford Foundation, gave me a grant, so that it was lucrative. And I turned it in, and the editors of Knopf read it, and they hated it. And they called me up, and they said, okay, well, we're gonna publish it, but we're going to give it to an editor who's going to take out all the negativity. What they wanted was the mythic version of the commercial press without fear and favor, Watergate, Pentagon, all that kind of stuff. Pentagon Papers. Well, that didn't go down too well. So I got Nation Books to buy it. Buy off, you get half your advance first. So I said, just pay half the advance, you get the whole book. And in that sort of transition period, I realized that it wasn't just the press that had collapsed, but all of the fundamental liberal institutions. within society. The liberal church, which I come out of, the labor as a force within society. Only 11.3% of the American working classes now belong to labor unions, many of them in the public sector, which means they can't strike. And we are seeing heavy assaults against teacher unions. I wrote in this book, I don't know if you have Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, this book I did with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco, but a chapter in that book is on Camden. We went to the poorest pockets of the United States. Camden, New Jersey is the poorest city per capita in the United States, also, not surprisingly, the most dangerous. And what did Camden do a few months ago? They just fired their entire police department because they're unionized, and then they created a county-wide police department, rehiring a lot of the people who were fired, and they're working without benefits at 50% of what they were paid before. This is the kind of corporatization of every aspect of society. So the press, labor, education, the liberal church, and of course, the Democratic Party. And the sort of poster child for, well, this book, I'm afraid also, I've known Michael Ignatieff for many years. I actually like Michael, although I'm sure he's not speaking to me anymore. We were, the first day of the war in Iraq, we were on a national program called Fresh Air, National Public Radio, and I was given, 12 and a half minutes or whatever it was to argue why we should not invade Iraq, and I didn't actually know who they had gotten to argue as to why we should invade Iraq, and it turned out to be Ignatieff. Although I've never been able to understand Michael's infatuation with American imperialism, I thought he was Canadian. And I was sort of heartbroken in a way, but Ignatieff is a kind of paradigm for that, for the neoliberalism, the new liberal, but Clinton wins the prize. Here you have a figure who speaks in that traditional feel-your-pain language of liberalism and yet betrays the very constituency that he or she purportedly represents. So you have Clinton ramming through NAFTA, the great betrayal of the American working class, probably the greatest betrayal since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very difficult to organize. Clinton destroyed our welfare system, and in the old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC, which allowed corporations like Clear Channel to buy up most of the radio stations, Rupert Murdoch News Corp. It was Clinton that vastly expanded our prison program, which a lot of people don't know, the omnibus program, exponentially exploding the prison population, very lucrative business, especially for the private prison industry. And it was Clinton that ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, something that did not happen in Canada because of Chrétien, but something that precipitated not only our national, but the global financial crisis. Clinton got what he was looking for, which was corporate money, so that by the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he got more. And Obama, for me, is a brand. He functions in the same way that, if you remember a few years ago, Calvin Klein and Bennington would have HIV-positive models and people of color on their billboards to associate their products with a kind of progressive politics or risque lifestyle or whatever. And that's exactly what the corporate state coughed up. And we're now, we start, as soon as somebody's elected president, we begin our new campaign. Now we're all sort of waiting for Hillary Clinton to run, and she can be our new brand. And that's why in 2008, when Obama won, Advertising Age gave Obama its top annual award, which was Marketer of the Year. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos, because they knew precisely what he had done. Now, the death of the liberal class, and I think that's essentially what's happened, the death of these liberal institutions is extremely dangerous. And Chomsky, this is an analysis I steal from Chomsky, who I think laid it out probably better than anybody. And Chomsky talks about how liberal institutions function as a kind of safety valve. I don't know if those are his exact words. Karl Popper, also in the Open Society and Its Enemies, talks about this, where you have institutions in a capitalist democracy that make incremental or piecemeal reform possible, so that when the economy or capitalism collapses in the 1930s, you are able to draw on a traditional liberal establishment, Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, his vice president, and others, who are able to ameliorate the legitimate grievances and suffering of the underclass. And when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism, and I think that's right. With the destruction of the liberal class, which is ultimately, I think, foolish on the part of these corporate forces, that mechanism is destroyed. That ability to carry out incremental or piecemeal reform is gone. And, you know, there's a writer who spends a lot of time writing about this, and that's Dostoevsky. That's what Demons is about. That's what Notes from Underground is about. It's about the collapse of liberalism. You know, Mouseman is sort of the cynical liberal who retreats underground. And Dostoevsky, who certainly saw what was coming, said that when that happens, you enter an age of moral nihilism. You also enter an age of political paralysis, an inability on the part of the centers of power to respond rationally to what's happening. And if any of you read the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, he writes week after week calling for a rational response. Now, what would be a rational response to the economic collapse? It would be, at a minimum, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, which is now the largest personal debt in the country, $1 trillion, a call for a jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25. That would be rational. Instead, when these grievances finally push people out into the streets, as they did in the Occupy movement, the response is force. You see the security and surveillance state, which has certainly migrated over the borders into Canada, as anybody who was at the G20 in Toronto understands, attempt to physically erase these movements. And that's very dangerous, because all of the grievances that pushed people into these encampments not only remain, but are getting worse. And so it's always the ruling class that determines the configurations of revolt or rebellion. And because the ruling class has not been able to respond rationally, because we live in a political and an economic system that is virtually paralyzed, which serves exclusively corporate interests, we are headed for political turmoil and upheaval. And the security and surveillance state knows it, which is why both in the United States and Canada you are seeing ramming through of draconian security laws. In the United States, and this is all under Obama, Obama's assault on civil liberties is actually far worse than the assault against civil liberties carried out by George W. Bush. It was Obama who approved the FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens. And we now know that all our personal information are being stored in perpetuity in supercomputers out in Utah. Why was it retroactive? Because when, after 9/11, the major telecommunications companies handed over this information in direct violation of our right to privacy, there were a series of cases in the lower courts working their way up. They knew they'd lose, and so their lobbyists made sure that written into the bill was retroactive immunity. It is the radical interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving Obama what he sees as the right to assassinate American citizens. It is the use of the Espionage Act 6 times. Now, the Espionage Act is the equivalent of our Foreign Secret Act. It was passed in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson, and it was never designed to shut down whistleblowers. It was designed to function as any Foreign Secrets Act is, which is giving information to a group or nation identified as, quote unquote, the enemy. It was used 3 times before Obama took office to try and shut down whistleblowers, the first time being against Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. Obama's used it 6 times, and he just sent a CIA official, Kiriakou, to jail for 30 months using the Espionage Act. Kiriakou exposed the use of torture, purportedly to the New York Times. And then finally, something called the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, which he signed into law a year ago, December 31st. Section 1021 permits the U.S. military to seize citizens who substantially support, that's the language of the section, that's not a materially support, that's not a legal term, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, again, a nebulous term. Hold them in military facilities. This is overturning 200 years of domestic law, stripping them of due process until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. I sued the president, and last September in the Southern District Court of New York, we won. And Obama has appealed it. What was interesting is we knew he'd appealed, but he didn't just appeal. Judge Catherine Forrest, who issued a ruling declaring Section 1021 unconstitutional, on the day of her ruling was visited in her chambers by government lawyers who said that they wanted an emergency stay, meaning put the law back into effect until the next highest court, the appellate court, hears the case. She refused, to her credit. This was a Friday afternoon. The lawyers then went to the appellate court, which is the court before the Supreme Court, and again said they needed an emergency hearing for 9 a.m. Monday morning, which they got. And they asked the court to put the law back into effect until the appeal was heard. The court granted them that temporary stay against the injunction. Now, that was quite telling to the lawyers and to myself, because it can only mean one thing, and that is they're already using the law. And I suspect they're using it against dual U.S. Pakistani nationals in places like Bagram or other black sites. Because if the injunction was allowed to stand and they were holding U.S. citizens and denying them due process, they would be held in contempt of court. So the state fully understands, and you see a series of measures being passed by the Harper government that are a kind of mirror of the creation to this security state. They know what's coming. They know that materially people in the industrialized world will not be able to achieve the level of consumption or comfort that the generations before them achieved. They know that we are rapidly being reconfigured into a kind of global neo-feudalism, a world where workers around the globe are played off of each other, so that workers in Canada or workers in the United States are told that they have to be competitive in a global marketplace, which means being competitive with sweatshop labor in Bangladesh that makes 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. There are no impediments left. That traditional liberal class that was able to make reform possible has been vanquished. And that brings us to Karl Marx, who correctly understood that unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. There's a very fine book called The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi, written in 1944, in which he writes about the force of unfettered, unregulated capitalism, which essentially, he says correctly, commodifies everything. Everything becomes a commodity. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that you then exploit until exhaustion or collapse. So 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts. And the response of corporate power is to send up ships and drop $500 million drill bits to mine the last vestiges of natural gas and oil and minerals and fish stocks out of the death throes of the planet. And that's precisely what we have evolved into. The further this distortion goes, the more the systems of information become degraded, so that we replicate, and I speak, as an American, in the kind of twilight of empire, the kind of moral and intellectual decline that always takes place within empire. And Cicero wrote about this at the end of the Roman Empire, where he talked about how the emotional and intellectual life of the citizen was being invested in the arena, in the spectacle, while all of the institutions of the Republic, while they remained, including the Senate, became a kind of species of political theater, which I think is precisely where we have come to as a culture, which means the only way that we have left to fight back is to step outside the formal mechanisms of power, which is why I was such a fervent supporter of the Occupy movement. None of the traditional mechanisms of power are going to save us. And we can just talk about the environmental crisis alone. They will exploit myopically. I sometimes think that it makes Herman Melville's Moby Dick the sort of most prescient study of the modern character. We're all on the Pequod, a ship named for an extinct indigenous tribe in North America. Ahab's in charge, and as Ahab said, my means are saying my motive and my object met. And not standing up, especially for students in this room, is a squandering of not only the possibilities for your generation, but all succeeding generations. It is, actually that grave, that these corporate forces in theological terms are systems of death. And the more they suck us dry, the more they degrade traditional mechanisms by which we were educated, informed, and empowered. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, especially, and I speak as a father with 4 kids, which is what puts me out in the streets. I mean, to be honest, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to my government. But I don't see that there's any option left. We will see something, and they know something is coming. And it is, in essence, the capacity on our part to rebuild these movements that they have destroyed, which is perhaps, our final hope. There's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, don't buy the book, where it's 1971, and Nixon and Kissinger are standing in the White House, and there's this gigantic anti-war demonstration. And Nixon has taken empty buses and put them in a ring around the White House as barricades, and he's sort of, folding his hands, and he's saying to Kissinger, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's exactly where we want people in power to be. Thank you. Yeah, so I know there's a reception at 6:15, so we have about 20 minutes if there are any questions.
What do you think of the Marxist argument that American imperialism was driven almost entirely by the search for resources and the protection of corporate interests, and the converse of that, or the corollary of that, that if you took away American dependence on Middle Eastern oil, Americans wouldn't care about the Middle East?
Well, he's asking what the Marxist argument that imperialism is driven by a search for resources. Yes, and trade. I mean, a monopolization of trade. Marx was right when Marx wrote that it was the conquest of the New World that essentially was used to fund and accelerate industrial society. It was built quite literally off of Inca gold.
If Americans all drove the
if America drove electric cars, would there be? It's a kind of non-starter as a question because ExxonMobil and BP and everyone else are going to make damn sure they destroyed the electric car. I mean, these corporate forces they determine our relationship to the planet and to each other, and the political establishment now is utterly beholden to what these corporations want. You see it in the inability to curb Wall Street. I mean, the looting of the U.S. Treasury is staggering. I mean, you have a company like Goldman Sachs that committed clear fraud. I mean, we have the documentary evidence, and yet the Federal Reserve is lending Goldman Sachs money at virtually 0% interest. And then those of us who are late on our credit card bills get to pay it back at 30% interest. That's not even capitalism. I don't even know what it is. I mean, and I think, you know, this is also Marx, that unfettered capitalism has built within it the seeds of its own destruction. And I think that's what we're seeing, that they, in essence, are hollowing the nation out from the inside. Civilizations always destroy their cities first. And Canada's, you know, well down this path as well. But you drive through, as I have, America, from Detroit to Camden to Cleveland, it's pretty terrifying what we've done. And what happens is as they hollow the nation out, there's a business term for it. You can go to the business school here and learn it. It's called harvesting. Then they have to employ the harsher techniques of control on the fringes of empire back to the heartland. So that's how you get militarized police. That's how you get a stripping of civil liberties. We have 160 law enforcement agencies in the United States who have applied for drone permits. That's how you get homeland security. You know, this vast bureaucracy. I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. I mean, and it becomes absurd because these systems, in order to perpetuate themselves, I mean, it sort of ends up being like an Ionesco or a Jari play, where in East Germany there was finally an informant for every 63 East Germans. I mean, they would infiltrate stamp clubs, which is sort of where we're at. Yeah, I think that you know, we are globally creating a paradigm that will lead to inevitable systems collapse.
Any student or individual we have a gym, like a recreation facility where we work out here on campus. And I noticed that recently there have been advertisements that have recruited for the military, and they've been appearing all over the gym. What is your opinion on that?
Well, take them down. I mean, America is just a sickeningly militarized culture. See, again, we're way ahead of you. You should all get on a bus, take a little tour of America, and then come back and you know what not to do. The highest good within American society is, you know, especially when you're in the South, like you're going through the airport in Atlanta or something, or Dallas, and you'll see uniformed service members go through and people will applaud. Now, I've covered wars of occupation. I know how dirty they are. I know what they're doing. And as I think our Congress has an approval rating of 9%. I mean, as the political paralysis continues, the reason that is dangerous is that self-identified liberals like Obama, although, of course, if the Democratic Party was in Europe, it would be a far-right party. But these self-identified liberals reminds me of Yugoslavia. You have a center that is unable to respond, as Krugman says, rationally. And so it's increasingly discredited. But what's also discredited are these purportedly liberal values. Weimar, you know, this is what happened at the end of Tsarist Russia, and you vomit up these very frightening distortions, like Radovan Karadzic or Slobodan Milosevic or the Nazi Party. And you have to remember that within American society, and I think this is a profound difference between Canada and the United States, is that America is a very violent culture. We are very violent. And if you just were to tick off the number of random gun shootings, it's a pretty staggering list. I mean, it's now become so common that within American society it doesn't even elicit, except maybe locally, much comment. And we have very powerful proto-fascist movements embodied in the Christian right, nativist groups, militias, the Tea Party, and the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, who speak in the language of violence, who celebrate the gun culture, and who do what fascist movements always do, which is demonize the vulnerable, undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, liberals. They have a long list of people they hate. And they are a powerful force within American culture. And so that the longer that paralysis continues, the more you empower these extremes. But because our movements have been destroyed, and I didn't get into it, but it's sort of 200 pages in Death of the Liberal Class, you know, our labor consciously destroyed in the name of anti-communism. Those of us who care about an egalitarian democracy, an open society, have been severely weakened. In essence, we are almost starting from scratch at a moment of crisis. So the celebration of the military and quote-unquote military values, the hyper-masculinity, the notion of obedience. Within the military, you're not, of course, taught to think, you're taught to obey. That is a kind of awful logic with the corporate state, which seeks closed, hermetically sealed, hierarchical institutions, and that's what a corporation is. But they seek, of course, to place that upon the wider society. And if you go to a megachurch, it's structured in exactly the same way. I wrote a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And you go to these megachurches, and it's a white male pastor who is in direct contact with God, who cannot be questioned. And you see these kind of rigid, hierarchical, male-dominated structures, which is what the military is. You just see that kind of blossoming throughout the wider society. So it fits precisely, and the celebration of the military, of quote-unquote military values, is something that goes hand in hand with the emergence of the corporate state.
You talked about briefly the role of journalism in the press. I'm wondering what you think of the role of satire, like figures.
That's a really good question.
Figures like Jon Stewart.
Yeah, I don't like them. That's a really good question. He's asking about the role of satire. For me, these figures like Stewart and Colbert, let's remember, number one, they're entertainers, and number two, they're millionaires. They're paid a lot of money to do this. They function the same way the cabarets function in Berlin with the rise of the Nazi Party. Everybody goes to the cabaret, laughs at all the buffoons like Goring, gobbles, and goes home. Michael Moore is a friend. I admire him. His heart's in the right place, but this isn't funny. It's not funny. There's nothing funny about our healthcare system, where 45,000 Americans a year die, where 1 million people a year go into bankruptcy because they can't pay their medical bills. There's nothing funny about the gun culture. There's nothing funny about it. And I think that you're going to laugh yourself right into the gulag. And that's exactly what happened. I understand that it's not Nazi Germany. I'm not trying to say that it is. But it is a species of totalitarianism, which has its own characteristics. But in essence, totalitarian is centralized power that cannot be checked or challenged in any way. So that corporate totalitarianism is different from fascism, is different from communism, what's called Stalinist communism. The person who sort of laid it out best is Sheldon Wolin, our greatest living political philosopher, in his book Democracy Incorporated, where he explains that what we live under is what he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means it's not a totalitarian system that finds its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, yet internally have gripped all the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. And so, you know, laughing at these bizarre figures like Newt Gingrich is to misunderstand their potency, and that, you know, we are really now devolving into a fight for our own survival. So, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of either Colbert or Stewart. You know, they're not going to go after corporate power. They will go after some of the sort of idiotic figures within the system, but they're not going to critique the system itself. I mean, the only sort of, when you talk about satire, the only person that I know who did that was the late George Carlin. But very, very few people do. And in a way, I think it's a kind of, works as a kind of safety valve to blow off steam, and I think diverts us from understanding what's happening.
The responsibility of journalists has always been to act as the people's watchdog, to keep a steady eye on corporations and government. But we live in a digital age now where the people formerly known as the audience are now creating content themselves. So I guess my question to you is, has the responsibility of journalists changed in a News 2.0 world?
She's asking about the responsibility of journalists in the digital age. Well, first of all, journalism, my wife's an actor and left Scarborough at 17, which I can understand, and went to Juilliard and never came back. And she's classically trained. So when I met her, she was starring in Antigone. Now, classical actors, like classical musicians, are lucky, even if they're steadily employed, to make $20,000, $25,000 a year. And that's what's going to happen to journalism. That's what's going to happen to teachers. I mean, I don't know the situation in Canada, but in the United States, only 35% now of professorships are tenure track. And I can guarantee you most of those are in the sciences, technology, and business schools, which are going to be funded by corporations. But if you're in the humanities, you're going to starve. So that if you get a degree in classics, you're going to be an adjunct, where you make $5,000 a course if you're lucky. You're not considered a full-time employee, so you don't have benefits, because this is really about a war against all of those, whether it's art, whether it's journalism, whether it's literature, whether it's philosophy. I spoke at the University of Washington. The state imposed 10% budget cuts, and they have this giant, gleaming, obscene business school in the center of campus. And what do? Instead of imposing it across the board, they abolished the theater and the philosophy department. This is insane, because it's a moment when we need desperately to teach people how to think critically for our own, literally for our own survival. So journalism will end up being like that. It will be extremely difficult, unless you go into public relations, which is about an evil, a discipline, I think, as can exist on the planet. You're not going to make any money. You're going to be, you're going to be reduced to living as a member of the working class. I mean, that's just the reality. Anybody who gets up and tells you that you're going to make a fine living writing for the internet is lying to you. It's just not true. That's the first thing. The second thing is that with all the many faults of newspapers, and that's a whole nother lecture, it did teach you the ability to report. And I worry that under the internet, we're not training another generation in the skills of reporting. I mean, if you think about it, the internet is completely inverted from traditional news, because you throw anything out there. Whereas when I started as a newspaper reporter, you had to go out, report a story, check it with other sources, fact check it, bring it back to your editor, it was edited, and then it was published. And there is very little real reporting done on the internet. Very, very little. There's some great commentary, but in terms of reporting, and especially investigative reporting. Investigative reporting, when I covered Al-Qaeda out of Paris, I wrote 5 stories that year. Now, some of those stories were 5,000 words long. They took me weeks to do, and I was traveling between different countries in order to put them together. It's extremely labor-intensive, and it's just expensive. And of course, as news organizations are downsized, one of the first things they do is get rid of that investigative journalist. And investigative reporting, journalism is not brain surgery, it's a trade, but it takes you 10 years to be a master carpenter, and I think it takes you a long time to be a good reporter. And I worry that we're losing that capacity. There will always be great journalists, but I think you see it with classical actors, they are going to be pushed to the margins. And you have this faux journalism. People who are making, Katie Couric was making $15 million a year on CBS News. I mean, this is insane. Let me guarantee you one thing, no journalist makes $15 million a year. It's all about that ability to connect and build a kind of emotional rapport, which is, of course, what electronic media is about. It's about how they make you. It's making you confuse how you are made to feel with knowledge. That's what skillful electronic media can do. So, we'll always have journalism, but like the arts, like the humanities, it's going to unfortunately be pushed to the very fringes of society.
What do you see as the role of students in kind of combating the system or opening a space in this kind of system?
I'm not going to chastise Canadian students because I'm sure you're more aware than American students. But within American universities, it's really disturbing because if you get to the elite universities, and I've taught at Princeton, Columbia, NYU, they don't question the system. They just want their space in it. And as they see this great divide, the destruction of the working class, the assault on the middle class, they're scared. I mean, at Princeton, the very first week of school, you have eating clubs in Princeton, which look like southern plantations. And there are eating clubs that to this day still have the entire service staff as African American. And the first week, you'll see these 18-year-old kids in tuxedos and the women in ball gowns going off to quote-unquote bid, to try and get in the right eating club, to network. I mean, it's sort of sad in a way. It's robbing them of their, robbing them of, I don't want to call it childhood, but robbing them of their youth to an extent. And so I find a profound inability in the part of students within these major universities to, again, ask the question. They don't challenge the system. And that's how you get, they hide the figures. 49%, as a couple years ago, of the graduating class at Harvard goes off, this is the university figures, to work in the financial services industry. Well, what they're not telling you is all the people who go to law school and end up becoming corporate lawyers, or all the people who go into public relations. I mean, at that point, you're talking 70, 80%. So here you're taking the supposed elite. I mean, I find it sort of amusing that Obama talks about how, we have to improve our educational system to be competitive with the rest. No, the people who totally fucked us up were the best educated people in the country. The problem wasn't education. Look at Larry Summers. The problem was greed. And so within the universities, within American universities, so, somebody came up to me a while ago and they said, look, I just started a doctoral program and, I know if I make a lot of waves, I'll get bounced out of the department. What do I do? I want to get my doctorate, but I don't want to, sell my soul. And I said, look, you better be a radical now, because what this entire system is about conditioning you and breaking you because when you spend in the United States 7 years for a doctorate, you've now invested so much. And then you go on and you want tenure, and by the time supposedly you get tenure, you speak out, that's, you've been, it's kind of Pavlovian training, you'll never do anything. So it's better to be a radical now and get thrown out of the program because at least you've still got that. I would say raise hell. I mean, all of the forces that have distorted and destroyed American universities are here. I know, I taught at UT, at the Monk School of all places, which is a giant whorehouse in the middle of the UT. And if you don't do it now, you'll never do it. So I don't know what the particular issues are here. I'm sure they're here. I'm sure these forces are not foreign to Western. But fight them, and fight them hard. Because in the end, they'll destroy your university. You mean creating a nationalized bank?
Like reinstating the Bank of Canada. So instead of paying interest on money that we're borrowing from the government, not lending it to ourselves for free, which is in our Constitution. So not like enriching the bankers, private banks who loan money to our government, but just spreading ourselves.
Well, when the bailout happened, Ralph Nader said, why are we giving all this money to Wall Street? Why don't we take, $100 billion, set up, capitalize 10 banks, national banks, at $10 million each, leverage them 10 to 1, and they can bail out people, make fair mortgages. That makes sense to me. I can't speak to specifically the Canadian issue because I'm just not in tune with it. But yeah, a forgiveness of foreclosures and bank repossessions is, you would think, would be absolutely elemental given the clear criminal activity and fraudulent behavior of Wall Street, and yet we're not doing it. So when I talk about paralysis, I talk about the inability of the government to step in and make rational solutions. And that's extremely dangerous. Well, I don't want to be a leader of a movement. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies said the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Harper. The question is how do you make the powerful frightened of you? And I think that, I am a great supporter of movements, and I've lived in France. Sarkozy was a cretin, and yet he was scared. My son, you go to college in the United States, it's $52,000 a year. I said to him, look, can you imagine Sarkozy getting up in France and telling French university students that they'd have to pay $52,000 a year? They'd shut the damn country down. What are you guys doing? And you see, within Canadian, I was sort of surprised when I was at UT, and this was a couple of years ago, to see the extent they're hammering Canadian students with loans, just like they're hammering American students with loans. But there's a kid down my street who is about $120,000 in debt. He's paying $700 a month, living with his parents. He's finished college. He can't get a job. He's painting houses. That's, debt peonage is become the new form of political control. And they starve institutions. They starve your healthcare program because they want to kill it. So the Canadian healthcare program is probably underfunded by 50%. That's on purpose. And they're doing the same thing in education. It's exactly the system that we've undergone within the United States because the engines behind it are the same, which are corporations.
Chris, what are your
You know, it's sort of a complicated question because, I mean, he did amazing stuff. You know, he kept whole parts of Harlem heated, kept Cuba heated, or whatever, air conditioned. And yet, you know, I lived in Latin America for 6 years. He has that kind of classic caudillo persona and mentality. One of the reasons I like the Occupy movement is I really don't like hierarchical structures. Now, you know, anybody who'd been to a General Assembly, I mean, sitting through a 7-hour General Assembly was, and yet I thought that there was something really healthy about that. I mean, Occupy was searching for different paradigms. It's far harder to decapitate a movement when it's like that. And one of the things, whatever you say about Occupy, it did take them forever to make a decision, but once they made one, they stuck by it. So, you know, those would be my critiques of Chavez, I think. Well, I was just at the Bradley Manning trial. I mean, here you had a classic whistleblower. He approached the New York Times, the Washington Post first, and you see what happens to anybody who challenges the official narrative. You know, Manning, you know, certainly the government is trying to make sure that Manning spends the rest of his life in prison, and they are working overtime. It's interesting during the trial that the prosecutors for Julian Assange were sitting in the courtroom because they want to extradite Assange on either conspiracy or espionage charges. So I think you know, I used to wonder, was Huxley right or was Orwell right? And it turns out they're both right. They were both right. First we got Huxley, you know, Wolin talks about access to credit and cheap mass-produced consumer goods as being political pacifiers. But now that that credit is gone and those cheap consumer products are no longer cheap, we're getting Oceania. We're getting you know, the iron fist of Big Brother. And we're reconfiguring the society as Oceania was, with, as Orwell writes, an inner party of 2 to 4%, an outer party, corporate managers, security and surveillance state, public relations, of 12 to 14%, and then 85% of us are proles. So in terms of journalism, I think what's most important is we begin to understand how power is configured, because if we are entranced by the mirage of the formal systems of power, the political theater, we end up doing what Bill McKibben did with 350.org, where you get 40,000 people on a Sunday walking around the White House and not stepping off the sidewalk. It's not going to stop the XL pipeline. The only thing that's going to stop the XL pipeline is the blockade. And McKibben would have been far better taking 50 people down to sit in front of the pipeline than 40,000 people standing around the White House chanting, as they did, "We are your supporters." And I think that that is a failure to understand where power lies. And we can't effectively fight back until we make an astute critique of power, which means that the very liberal institutions are essentially our enemy in this sense, that they divert energy back into a dead political system. So I think that it's incumbent upon us, and frankly, the only way that's going to happen is for you to shut down your electronic hallucinations. Turn off Facebook, don't put anything in your ears, throw out your TV, I don't tweet, you know, any of that. You have to read. And that's what frightens me, that as we sever ourselves from a print-based culture, we lose the capacity to deconstruct the culture around us, which I think is only going to come through print. So I don't think, you know, you have to read Wolin, you have to read Marx, You know, you have all of this stuff you're never going to get electronically. And then you'll have to find you'll have to like date someone who it also lives like that, because otherwise they'll think you're a freak. Well, for me, it was sort of sad because usually when I get a call, or used to be, when I got a call from the CBC or I got the BBC, I didn't ask what the program was, I just did it. So I was actually in Washington at an Occupy event, and CBC asked me to come in. What's the name of his show? I don't even know what it's called. What's it called? Whatever the show was. Anyway, I didn't know it. I'm not Canadian, I don't know. But I knew it was the CBC, and then I end up with this idiot. I was pissed anyway because I'd left something that I thought was pretty important for the CBC to listen to this garbage. I mean, classic Fox News, degenerating from the very beginning to lowest common denominator. I'll call you a name and then you call me a name. I just don't have any time for it. So I think it was a window into the kind of corruption, not only within the CBC, but within the airwaves in Canada. I believe, don't you have a channel called Sun or something? Isn't that like your Fox News? I mean, look, this is just scary stuff because facts are irrelevant. Opinions are true. In essence, lies are true. Facts and opinions are interchangeable. It's all about how you feel and how you're made to feel. And that is, of course, empire of illusion, but that's the society we are slipping towards. And so you're not as far gone as we are. But every time I come up, I see indications that you're headed in that direction. Right, but I mean, we spend 50% of all discretionary spending goes where? The military. There's an easy. We don't spend very much on Medicare. I mean, if you look at the pie charts, it's very little. What? It's not very much. I mean, it's a manufactured crisis. And, we don't have a deficit problem. We have a revenue problem. These corporations, General Electric doesn't pay income tax. Neither does Bank of America. So what is the role of liberal institutions? Well, traditionally, liberal institutions would create a kind of balance between a corporate oligarchic elite and the citizenry, so that the natural excesses of capitalism, which is always about expansion. I mean, there's no self-imposed limits. They provide a mechanism by which there's a kind of equilibrium. Capitalist forces are not allowed to rape the rest of the country and the citizenry. Now those liberal institutions don't work. So you are seeing whole parts of the United States resemble the third world. I mean, that's Sacco and I on this book. That's where we went. So you're, for instance, in a place like Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is a native community, and the average life expectancy for a male is 48. That's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. At any one time, 50 to 60% of the dwellings, many of which are sod huts, have neither electricity or running water. These people are utterly invisible because we're all watching, I don't know, what's her name, Kim Kardashian or whoever it is. And so because the liberal institutions have collapsed, because there is no firewall, because there is no mechanism now to prevent predatory corporate capitalist forces from squeezing the last drop out of us, these liberal institutions have become redundant. I mean, I think that's my point. The role of liberal institutions is to halt those kinds of excesses. And in fact, in a capitalist democracy, they're absolutely vital. And I think it is very short-sighted on the part of these corporate forces to destroy them, but they have. Yeah.
So, are you saying that the role of liberal institutions is to safeguard capitalism?
Of course.
Okay, this is sort of what I'm getting at. Because you're talking about, like, so it's like the corporation as a problem. I mean, name the beast. Capitalism is the problem. Because before the liberal institutions were eradicated, it was the really radical institutions that were eradicated. The labor movement, especially, groups like the Industrial Workers of the World, who revealed anti-racist, actually really direct action oriented, very, very grassroots oriented. They were really crushed by the US state. I mean, there was a radical institutions who had the chance of actually pushing through.
Of course. That is the argument of my book, that it was and that's when I mentioned Zinn. It was the radical movements that pressured the formal mechanisms of power to respond. So you eradicate the radical movements, which we've done. Labor, alternative press, we used to have a liberal wing of the Democratic Party. All of that's gone. I mean, the liberal class was never designed to be the political left. So you destroy your radical movements, and then you, in the name of anti-communism, you hollow out your liberal institutions, and your state ossifies. But yes, the liberal class was designed because they set the parameters of debate. I mean, for instance, you could critique the war in Vietnam or you could critique the war in Iraq, but you couldn't question the virtue of the leadership. You couldn't question the system of capitalism itself. Once you cross those lines, you instantly become a pariah. And that's why the class or the group that hates Noam Chomsky the most is not the right wing. It's the liberal class, because Chomsky exposes their complicity with the systems of power.
So, just one question then. So, do you lament the loss of liberal class, or you just because that's the thing.
I lament the loss of the radical movements. I would not, I don't define myself as a member of the liberal class. That's when somebody asks me about power. It's why I think, I'm with Julian Benda, The Treason of Intellectuals, that you get to serve in life two sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. But the more you make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And in that sense, I'm an anarchist in that I believe that power is the problem. And that for those of us who care about an egalitarian society, there should be a perpetual alienation from power and a constant pushing back against power. And the idea that, we're going to elect people to save us. People who get elected become invested in the systems of power. That what created the middle class, what created universal health care in Canada were labor unions. Unfortunately, your labor unions, for us anyway, were more enlightened than ours. Well, we had enlightened unions, this old CIO and the Wobblies, and they were destroyed. So I lament the loss of those radical forces, which opened up the democratic system. And I don't have time to go into it, but it's in the book, Death of the Liberal Class. It all began with World War I and the Committee for Public Information, which was the first system of modern mass propaganda, which destroyed the radical movements. Randolph Bourne writes about it, and Jane Addams and others. And these people employed the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, Sigmund Freud, and others, that people were not moved by fact, but by the manipulation of emotion, what Walter Lippmann calls manufacturing consent. And when World War I is over, as Dwight MacDonald writes, instantly the dreaded Hun is replaced with a dreaded Red, and we enter what MacDonald calls the psychosis of permanent war. And he says none of the political theorists, including Marx, grappled with this concept of permanent war, where you're constantly trying to ferret out the internal enemy. It's why, after the Cold War, they needed the war on terror. It's just the same paradigm, because it has a capacity to crush radical movements and, in essence, disembowel liberal institutions. On the eve of World War I, we had a powerful socialist movement in the United States. Eugene Debs in 1912 got 6% of the vote when he ran for president. 900,000 votes. We had some of the most popular publications in the country, the Masses, Appeal to Reason, were socialist journals, 70 socialist mayors. And it's all gone, and they couldn't be happier. And where did that system of propaganda go? Once the war was over, it went straight to Madison Avenue and began working on behalf of corporations, which upended traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, and replaced them with consumption as a kind of inner compulsion and the cult of the self. So that when we talk about when we talk about American values, for instance, what we're really talking about are corporate values, imposed corporate values. So, you know, I lament not the death of the liberal class, although, I mean, to be fair, I was brought up and nurtured by liberal institutions, the liberal church, institutions, the New York Times, but what terrifies me are the loss of these radical forces that were able to push back. Should we do one more? Okay, go ahead. Oh, WikiLeaks was seismic. You know, the information that Manning passed on to WikiLeaks exposed the lies, malfeasance, and criminal activity and war crimes that were being hidden from the wider public. And WikiLeaks published this information in the same way the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers. There's no difference. Assange essentially played the role of the New York Times in the modern age. And in fact, the New York Times played the role of the New York Times because, again, there's a perfect example of how alternative systems of information, the reason the New York Times printed that stuff with their teeth grit is because you had alternative press. If one thinks of WikiLeaks as an alternative press, which I do, would have published it and it would have exposed them for who they were. They were forced to publish it, which is why you then saw them turn on both Assange and Manning once. I mean, it was quite callous and brutal, but they published the stuff and then turned on both Assange and Manning and not only refused to support them but condemned them. So, no, I look at WikiLeaks, I look at Manning as a kind of modern version of Daniel Ellsberg, and Ellsberg looks at it, Manning as a modern version of Daniel Ellsberg. And I look at WikiLeaks as essentially assuming the role that the New York Times assumed when it published the Pentagon Papers. So I've been a fervent supporter of Manning, and I think actually I may go see Assange in a couple of weeks. He's free. All right, thanks.